After spending nearly 16 years on row, William Henry Hance was sentenced by electric chair in Georgia. But to understand how he ended up there, we have to go back to the disappearance of Gail Jackson, and the letters that taunted police, predicted her fate, and led to something far darker. Columbus, Georgia was already on edge. A serial offender, nicknamed the Stalking Strangler, was targeting elderly white women across the city. At the same time, the bodies of 2 young black adult workers had been found just outside Fort Benning. Fear was everywhere. And then, more women began disappearing. On February 27, 1978, Gail Jackson vanished. Days later, the car she'd been driving was found abandoned near the Sand Hill Bar and Grill in Columbus. But that wasn't all. Just as investigators began retracing her steps, something unusual happened. Between March 3 and April 5 of that year, Columbus Police Chief Curtis E. McClung received a series of chilling letters. They were written on official U.S. Army stationery, and signed by someone calling himself the Chairman of the Forces of Evil. The focus of the letters: Gail Jackson and another missing black woman named Irene Thurkield. The writer made threats. If the so-called Stalking Strangler wasn't caught, or if $10,000 wasn't delivered, the women's lives would be taken. What followed next would shake the community to its core. On March 27, 1978, investigators received another chilling letter. The same unknown author, still calling himself Chairman of the Forces of Evil, wrote that Gail Jackson's arm would be broken and that a fatal blow would be delivered to her head. He added that authorities would be contacted with directions to her final resting place. 3 days later, on March 30, the silence was broken. At Fort Benning, military police telephone operators picked up a call. That same day, the Columbus Police Department also received a call. On the line was a calm voice, male, African American, identifying himself once again as the Chairman of the Forces of Evil. He gave a detailed description of a location near Sand Hill. Officers moved quickly. And just as described, there they found the body of Gail Jackson. What they uncovered was gruesome. Jackson's face and skull had been brutally crushed. Her jawbone was fractured in multiple places. Small fragments of bone and teeth were scattered around her remains. Her left arm, just as the letter had promised, was completely dislocated at the elbow. According to the medical examiner, she had been beaten repeatedly with a heavy object, most likely a tire iron or jack handle. The injuries had not been random or impulsive, they were methodical and aggressive. There was no doubt that this was a calculated homicide. But the horror didn't stop there. On April 3, 1978, just days after Jackson's body was recovered, the skeletal remains of another woman were found on the Fort Benning reservation. Her name was Irene Thurkield. She was also a young black woman, known to frequent the same areas as Gail. But what authorities found was even more devastating. Irene's head was nearly gone. Most of her skull had been shattered. Massive trauma to her cranium suggested that she, too, had been bludgeoned with extreme force, again, most likely with a jack handle. The cause of her passing was the same, blunt force trauma to the head. And there were unmistakable parallels between the two homicides. Both victims had been dumped in isolated, wooded areas just off access roads. Both had clearly been dragged from nearby roads, their bodies half concealed by underbrush. Both women were in varying states of undress, though investigators wouldn't clarify the full nature of the violations. And both were black, young, and vulnerable. The public was still reeling from the unsolved Stalking Strangler homicide targeting elderly white women in Columbus. But now it seemed another predator was on the loose, one who had targeted black women. And unlike the anonymous figure behind the Stalking Strangler cases, this offender was toying with police, writing letters, making calls, leaving clues. He wanted to be seen. He wanted control. And now, 2 women were gone. As the investigation closed in, a new name surfaced: William Henry Hance. Fort Benning's Criminal Investigation Division had quietly learned that Hance had been the last person seen with Irene Thurkield before she vanished. It wasn't just a lead, it was a turning point. On April 4, 1978, investigators brought Hance in. He was read his Miranda rights. Calmly, he waived them. And then, without hesitation, he agreed to talk. What he said next would turn the case upside down. In his initial statement, Hance admitted to it all. He said he had been the one who captured both women. He had written the letters. He had made the phone calls. But according to Hance, he hadn't acted alone. He claimed he was under orders from a shadowy group he called the Forces of Evil. He insisted they had threatened him, that they had forced his hand, that he was simply carrying out what they demanded. Investigators listened, but they weren't convinced. The next day, April 5, 1978, Hance changed his story again. This time, there were no shadowy figures, no threats, just a man, alone, admitting to 2 brutal homicides. In his confession, Hance said he had met Gail Jackson at the Sand Hill Bar and Grill. She approached him, he said, and offered her body for $20. He agreed. They left together in his car, driving only a short distance before, according to him, she began to undress. That's when something in Hance snapped. He claimed to be angry, disgusted. He pulled over, lashed out, and hit her with what he called a karate chop to the head. When she slumped across the door, injured but still alive, he dragged her into the woods. Then he returned to his car. He grabbed a jack handle, went back into the woods, and, finding her still breathing, delivered the final blows. He beat her in the head until she stopped moving. Then he left her, alone, in the woods. And he didn't stop. In that same confession, Hance admitted to taking Irene Thurkield's life. Though the details were less vivid, he offered no denial, only acknowledgement. But even then, the truth was still unraveling. The following day, April 6th, Hance gave yet another statement. In this one, he said that Jackson's proposition had left him shaken. He described being overwhelmed by rage. While dragging her lifeless body through the brush, he claimed to hear something pop, perhaps her arm, dislocating. And then, almost as an afterthought, he admitted it. The forces of evil, they didn't exist. They were just him. The group didn't exist. It was just him, alone, and responsible. And for the justice system, that was enough. The confessions were in. The details matched the scenes. And with every word Hance put on record, he sealed his own fate. There would be no more letters, no more phone calls, no more hiding. The law would take it from there. 8 a.m., March 31, 1994. Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison, Jackson, Georgia. It was quiet behind the prison gates, the kind of silence that builds as the clock runs out. William Henry Hance had been on row for nearly 16 years. Now, the end was hours away. And if he felt anything in that moment, he didn't show it. From the moment he confessed, the outcome was clear. He had admitted to the homicides, described them in detail, invented a group, the forces of evil, only to admit later that it was just him. Every word, every contradiction, every lie and half-truth had followed him through the years, echoing in courtrooms and appeal hearings. His attorneys had fought hard, but the system had already made up its mind. They argued he wasn't the monster the world saw, that somewhere inside him, there had been trauma, a brokenness, something that might explain what he had done. At trial, clinical psychologist Dr. Louis R. Lieberman took the stand for the defense. His testimony was clear. Hance suffered from a personality disorder. He described a man who was egocentric, emotionally detached, and unable to fully grasp the weight of his actions. Hance, he said, struggled to admit wrongdoing. When faced with mistakes, he blamed others or covered them up. It was a pattern that ran deep. But Dr. Lieberman also admitted something that would haunt the defense. There was no medical or organic cause for Hance's behavior. It wasn't brain damage. It wasn't insanity. And even if Hance had trouble controlling himself, the psychologist was clear. He knew right from wrong. Always had. That mattered. Because in the eyes of the court, knowing the difference between right and wrong meant accountability. It meant no matter the disorder, the law still applied. Under cross-examination, Lieberman made another point. People with personality disorders rarely get better. And in the 6 years since he'd first evaluated Hance, there had been no sign of improvement. No mellowing, no shift, just the same cold distance. That testimony sealed what little hope remained. Still, others came forward. First Sergeant Ronald R. Nelson, a respected Army officer, told the jury that Hance had once been dependable, trustworthy, a good soldier who had fallen into financial and marital strain. Stress, he said, might have pushed him too far. He wasn't making excuses, just offering context. Then came character witnesses, fellow inmates, old acquaintances. Charles Westcott, who had known Hance for 20 years, painted a different picture. He described a man who was courteous, industrious, someone who had never caused trouble in the community. Westcott also revealed something personal, that Hance's own mother, who was disabled, had passed from a physical altercation and was later found violated. It was an eerie parallel to the lives Hance had taken, and some thought maybe it had left a scar that never healed. But in the end, none of it mattered enough. The jury saw the act, heard the confession, weighed the lives lost, and they knew what the law required. When William Henry Hance finally took the stand, the courtroom was silent. It was a final attempt to change how the jury saw him. His voice was calm, almost detached, as he told the jury about the unraveling of his life. He spoke of March 1977, the month his marriage collapsed. He was divorced, broke, and sliding deeper into instability. What happened to his disabled mother, still unsolved, had left him deeply disturbed. He told the court how the memory of it sickened him, how it lingered and festered in his thoughts. Then he spoke about the homicides. He said he didn't know why he took Gail Jackson's life, that she was a stranger to him. He admitted it was senseless, without motive, and that something in him had simply snapped. For Irene Thurkield, he claimed he had lost control entirely, his mind flipped, he said. There was no calculation, no premeditation, just chaos and fury boiling over. It was a thin defense. He didn't deny responsibility. Not anymore. In front of the jury, Hance said he had begged for God's forgiveness. That he had accepted what he had done and lived with the weight of it every day. He asked the jury to forgive him too. He spoke of growth, 6 years of reflection since his first conviction. He said he had changed. Found peace, found God. That whatever demons had controlled him then no longer had a grip on him now. But the jury had already heard enough. The horror of what he had done, luring women into isolated woods, the brutal blows to their skulls, the jack handle he used to silence them, was not something they could overlook. They had read the letters, heard the confessions. Imagine the final moments of Gail Jackson and Irene Thurkield in grim, vivid detail. So, when it came time to decide his fate, their verdict was cold and final. For the homicide of Gail Jackson, the jury sentenced William Henry Hance to face the highest penalty. The act, they said, was outrageously or wantonly vile, horrible or inhuman, a classification that required aggravated battery and exceptional cruelty. The physical trauma inflicted on Jackson's body, her shattered skull, dislocated arm, and the blunt force trauma that ended her life fit the definition exactly. In civilian court, he was sentenced to go for Jackson's homicide. In military court, for the homicide of Irene Thurkield, he received a life sentence. But even that would not last. The military conviction was overturned on a legal technicality, but it didn't matter. His fate had already been sealed in Georgia's civilian court. One sentence remained, and it carried the full weight of finality. All appeals were denied. Clemency was refused. Tea time was running out. William Henry Hance would be sentenced. And this time, the system would make sure he had no chance to disappear into the shadows again. 2 p.m., March 31, 1994. Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison, Jackson, Georgia. If you're still with us, consider subscribing for more important stories like this. Time was running out. William Henry Hance had exhausted nearly every legal avenue available to him. But in these final hours, he tried one more, another appeal to the state, hoping for a stay. A pause. A final attempt for a stay, but the odds were slim. And the cracks in the system had already started to show. Just one day earlier, a critical document from the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles was filed, a denial of Hance's clemency request. But the wording was riddled with errors. The language had been mistakenly copied from a ruling meant for another inmate. Hance's name was listed, but the content wasn't even about him. Still, the sentence was allowed to proceed. That same day, the Georgia Supreme Court denied his final appeal by a narrow margin, 4 votes to 3. But there were deeper problems, and they had started long before the date was set for his sentence. During his second sentencing trial, which had been ordered after his first conviction was overturned for prosecutorial misconduct, a woman named Patricia LeMay served on the jury. After the verdict was rendered, she came forward. What she revealed sent a ripple through Georgia's legal community. According to LeMay, several jurors had made racist comments about Hance, calling him, just one more sorry and asterisk that no one would miss, and saying that once he was sentenced, it would be, one less and asterisk to breathe. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was the kind of language that cast doubt on the fairness of the entire process. There had only been one black juror. Her name was Gail Lewis Daniels. She was 26 years old. Both LeMay and Daniels later confirmed that Daniels had refused to vote for the highest penalty. But she was outnumbered, isolated. The other jurors ignored her objection and told the judge they had reached a unanimous decision. When Daniels was asked to confirm the verdict aloud, she stayed silent. Behind the scenes, Daniels had been warned, if she went against her earlier statement, that she could vote for the highest penalty, she could be charged with perjury. In the pressure of that courtroom, she folded. The sentence was allowed to stand. And so, at 2 p.m. that afternoon, while Hance waited behind concrete walls, the machinery of justice kept moving forward. There would be no pause. no relief, just time slipping away. As night fell on Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison, William Henry Hance was still holding on, waiting, hoping. He was still waiting, hoping someone might stop the clock. But the U.S. Supreme Court had made its decision. In a 6-3 vote, they declined to even consider his final appeal. One of the dissenters, Justice Harry Blackmun, wrote with unmistakable weight. He had recently concluded that the highest penalty could not be fairly applied under the Constitution, but even setting that aside, he still believed Hance's case was different. It wasn't just about procedure. It was about what had been ignored. There is substantial evidence, Blackmun wrote, that William Henry Hance is mentally retarded as well as mentally ill. There is reason to believe that his trial and sentencing proceedings were infected with racial prejudice. One of his sentencers has come forward to say that she did not vote for the highest penalty because of his mental impairments. At the time of his trial, Hance had tested with an IQ between 75 and 79. On modern scales, that qualified him as borderline intellectually disabled. He also had a long documented history of mental illness. But in the eyes of the courts, none of it was enough to stop what had already been set in motion. No one was listening anymore. He was scheduled to go that night. The record does not preserve what Hance chose for his final meal. Whatever it was, it would be his last. At 10 p.m., he was escorted by prison guards to the chamber. The room was quiet, cold, mechanical. He sat down in Georgia's electric chair. The current surged through his body. His limbs shook aggressively. His heart raced, and within minutes, it was over. At 10:10 p.m., William Henry Hance was pronounced lifeless. He became the 231st person sentenced in the United States since the highest penalty was reinstated in 1976, and the 18th sentenced in Georgia. But Hance's sentence would not fade into silence. Afterward, the revelations brought forth by jurors Patricia LeMay and Gail Lewis Daniels sparked outrage. Editorials condemned the state's failure to acknowledge racial bias, mental impairment, and jury misconduct. One newspaper wrote, "Hance might as well have been lynched, for he was denied due process of law." There is compelling evidence that the law was not followed, that Hance's civil rights were violated, that he was a victim of racism and political expediency. The following year, at a legal conference, attorney Ronald J. Tabak delivered a pointed summary of what many already suspected. He argued that race had played a role in both Hance's prosecution and sentencing. That justice had not been blind, but deliberately selective.